Hi everyone, Ryan here from Fight Game Analysis, and today we're going to be talking about Tyson Fury's place amongst the all-times of the heavyweight division. But before we jump into that, if you've been enjoying the content, please go ahead and click on the like button and also subscribe to the channel. Really appreciate your support. Alright, so just last night we saw the fight wrap up. Tyson Fury went out there and absolutely dominated Dillian Whyte. Absolutely dominated, won every round, and then goes and blows him out with just a picture-perfect uppercut to close the show. And in the wrap-up in the post-fight, he says, that's it, I'm done. Look, I told my wife that after the Deontay Wilder trilogy that I was going to hang it up. This opportunity to come and fight in Wembley in front of all these people and back, have a homecoming. It was too much. I couldn't pass it up, but now I got to call it quits. So let's just take the man at his word. Let's just say that that's it. He's hanging the gloves up. Now is a great opportunity for us to kind of evaluate what his career has looked like, what he's been able to do, who he's been up against, where he ranks amongst the all-times. You know, it's really difficult to have a conversation and say who is the absolute all-time greatest heavyweight, much less the all-time greatest fighter. It's really difficult because it's hard to compare people amongst eras, right? I mean, one of the easiest ways that a recognition and how difficult it is was they chop things, right? Old era, modern era. It's one of the ways that we see these things defined. But even when people in the same era, even if people in the modern, all who are considered in the modern era, it becomes very difficult to compare people from these different time periods, right? So one of the things that I like to do as a starting point is kind of think where a man ranks in his generation amongst his own time period. Now look, when we talk about the heavyweight division, we are talking about the most historical division in boxing. But we're talking about a division that has had absolutely legendary names from guys like Jack Johnson, John O'Sullivan, Joe Louis, and the list just goes on and on and on, right? We can talk about Rocky Marciano and all kinds of guys throughout the years who have done all kinds of great things. But I'm not going to go back that far. I just want to start it off when we talk about this conversation. I start to talk about people as far as the greatest of their generation in heavyweights. I'm going to start the conversation off with Muhammad Ali, right? He's a guy that we kind of reach back when he won the belt in '65, so we're talking about a significant period of time. But it's also somebody that a lot of people are familiar with, and it's easy to kind of draw a lineage from that. So let's start off. We talk about the greatest heavyweights of their generation. I want to start off, we're going to talk about Muhammad Ali. Okay, and I'm going to put him at achieving that status easy when he won the belt, 1965. You know, he goes out there, he's an underdog, brash talker, wins the belt against somebody that people just absolutely feared, man. And he went out there and won the belt in impressive fashion. Goes out in the rematch, does the exact same thing in even more impressive fashion. And he pretty much dominated from that point in his career on. Now, look, he had a 3-year hiatus in there from like 67 to 70 or 71 or something along those lines. He refused to enter the draft to go into the military. This was during Vietnam. So he wasn't able to allow, I believe it, he wasn't able to allow to box on American soil. I think that's what it was. He was overseas, or maybe he wasn't allowed to box professionally. I don't remember what exactly it was, but he was competing in some bouts. Maybe they were exhibitions. I'll have to figure out the details of it, but nevertheless, he comes back 1970, 1971 and continues to dominate, picks up where he left off and goes out there. And by the time his career is said and done, he's got wins basically over everybody. Everybody that you can think of from his generation, he's got wins over all of them. Ken Norton, George Foreman, Joe Frazier, Chuck Wepner, Ernie Shavers, everybody. Jerry Corey. It doesn't matter. He went over there, he beat them all. Does he have some losses? Sure, he's got a few losses on that record, but he beat everybody. And there's nobody else who can say that. There's nobody else who can turn around and say that they beat everybody. There's nobody else who can turn around and say that they had the dominance that he had during that time period. That makes Muhammad Ali the best of his generation. Now, the man who ended up defeating him, Larry Holmes, is the guy who I think picked up the torch. Now, one thing I want to say is I think Larry Holmes is just, historically speaking, Holmes is a little bit underrated, man. And I want to say that's because he went out there and he gave Muhammad Ali such a bad beating. And Muhammad Ali he wasn't just a fighter, man. People loved him. People loved Muhammad Ali for a variety of reasons. Part of which is, his charisma and his character. Maybe it was his political beliefs or what he stood for from a moral perspective. Could just be a real like of his fighting style and just how he came across and everything else, maybe what he did for the sport. Nevertheless, there's a lot of different reasons that a lot of people have, but he was loved. He was one of those transcendental guys, right? It eclipsed the sport, became bigger than the sport. So when you have the unfortunate timing of being the man to take him off his crown, being the man to just give him that vicious beating. It doesn't matter how good you are, dude. It doesn't matter how much you shine. There's always going to be a certain percentage of people that can't stand you. It's always going to be a certain percentage of people that won't give you your due credit, right? It just happens. That's just the way things fall sometimes. And I think that's part of Larry Holmes' story. Right? One of the, in my opinion, one of the best jabs of all time, dude. That jab was incredible. You want to talk about jabs, man. Go back and look at what Larry Holmes used to do to guys with that jab. It's like his left arm was like twice as big as his right arm. He was just sticking it out there like a telephone pole, hammering guys with it. Great jab. And I say he probably was the man all the way up until he lost. He had two close losses to Michael Spinks. I want to say it was like 85, 86. Retires for a little bit, comes back out of retirement, ends up getting smoked by Mike Tyson. And Mike Tyson is actually the man to take the crown from him. Right? We'll say it was, I want to say it was like 1987. So we've got Muhammad Ali from approximately 65 all the way until I want to say 1980. Then we step forward, we look at Larry Holmes from 1980 to about 1985, 1986. Then we look at Mike Tyson from about 1970 to, I'll say, I mean, I know he lost that fight to Buster Douglas, but we'll just say that his time period extended from about 1987 until the time that he ended up getting locked up in like 90 or 91. Right? He fought a few fights after that one. Easy to see why. You know, relatively speaking, it was kind of it wasn't a very dominant era. It wasn't a very super competitive area, that late 80s. But Mike Tyson could have made a splash in any area that he was in. He was just ferocious and aggressive in the way that he worked the body and the combination punching and the power that he had. He was going to go in there and he was going to make a splash. He was going to make his name known no matter what era that he came out in. But he was in there in the late 80s, and during that brief period of time, call it maybe 4 years, he was the most dominant heavyweight that there was. A couple years after that, I want to say that it wasn't really defined for a little bit of time. You know, we had Evander Holyfield out there. We had Riddick Bowe out there. We had a few guys out there. None of them, in my opinion, by the time it was all said and done, we can't look back and say that they captured the crown. We can't look back and say that they were the man. We can't look back and say that they dominated the time period. The man who dominated that time period next was Lennox Lewis. Now, I want to say that he, 93, maybe 94, I don't know, something along those lines, kind of really comes onto the scene. And all the way up until he retired in 2001, he was the man. He had a couple losses in there, came back and avenged both those losses. Particularly the one that stands out in my mind was Hakeem Rockman. Rockman gets him, he comes back, knocks him out earlier in the rematch. Lennox Lewis ended up beating everybody. Lennox Lewis did so in dominating fashion. He went out there, beat guys up with the jab, landed the heavy right hand behind him. Fought tall, fought long, really made his name known, stuck his flag in the ground for that time period. Now, his last fight against Wladimir Klitschko. If you haven't seen it, please go back and watch that fight. It is just amazing. It's the one that Klitschko jumped onto the stage with. He was a late replacement in that fight. I don't remember who he was replacing right now, but he was a late replacement in that fight. He was overlooked by a lot of people. Nobody knew who he was. This Klitschko guy, he comes over there and he gave Lennox Lewis everything he could handle. There's a lot of people who had him winning that fight up until the time of the stoppage. And Lennox Lewis didn't get that stoppage by knocking dude out. Lennox Lewis got that stoppage from a cut. But let me also say that Lennox Lewis probably landed one of the most ferocious uppercuts I've ever seen in my life during that fight. Like, that was the type of uppercut that when people were sitting ringside, you hear him interviewed, people who saw that side for the first time, if they're just mesmerized and they're super focused, look, when he landed that uppercut, their heads moved. Like they thought Klitschko's head was going to pop off, man. That's how ferocious that uppercut that Lennox Lewis landed was, man. Just something else. Ridiculous. So that ends up being Lennox Lewis's last fight. He bows out. Now, little side note, I think Vitaly Klitschko was actually the better of the two Klitschko brothers. I think he was the better fighter. He was definitely more unorthodox, definitely didn't come in there and use just like the hardcore fundamentals that you saw from Wladimir, but I think he was just nastier and tougher and grittier. I think he had more power, and I think he just had this way about him of going in there and imposing his will and getting his style off and just getting his shots off and making things happen. The reason that he wasn't able to be dominant for that long, like, he was in there and he held that one belt for a very long time, and his brother held the other three, but the reason that he wasn't able to go in there and, in my opinion, even do more it was just because of the injuries. He just had some nasty back injuries that plagued him for a long time throughout his career, ended up retiring early because of it. But if it would not have been for those injuries, I think his coming on stage in that Lennox Lewis fight, Lennox Lewis retiring, I think Vitaly Klitschko would have been the man to assume the crown and take over at that point. Nevertheless, it was not him. It was his brother Wladimir. Right? Wladimir was over there getting trained by Emanuel Stewart, and he dominated, man, in an era that was, again, a lot of people considered very uncompetitive. A lot of people do not look back at the time period from, say, like 2001, 2003, all the way up until like 2015 as any kind of a golden age for the heavyweights. Nobody's going to look back at that time period and think about the amazing fights we got, the amazing athletes that were in the division, just the competitiveness, the rematches and the trilogies and how much we were looking forward to everything. Nobody's going to say that about that. Nobody's going to say that about that time period. But what we saw was absolute dominance by Wladimir Klitschko. He was able to basically go out there and dominate everybody with just the jab. Able to go out there and put in all that work with the jab. Guys got out of line a little bit. He would land that hard, super straight right hand on him. Every now and then he'd break out the left hook, and that was it, man. Even his trainer, Emanuel Stewart, used to say, like, dude, you have to capture people's imagination more. You got to do bigger things. You need to go out there and knock people out, be more aggressive, take some chances. And it just wasn't his style, man. It just wasn't how he got down. Didn't really have to. And he was the man all the way up until 2015. That's when he lost to Tyson Fury. That's when Tyson Fury really jumped up and established himself as the man who beat the man who beat the man. He was now the man. And in my opinion, he remained the man from 2015 all the way up until last night when we saw him scorch Dillian Whyte with a beautiful uppercut. 2022, right? So you got a 7-year period there. Now, a lot of people will tell me, like, Ryan, what are you talking about? He stepped away from the game for a while during that time period. How could he be the man? Look, I get that. And that's when we saw two people rise really to the occasion and become the center of attention in the boxing world, right? On each side of the Atlantic Ocean. We had Deontay Wilder, who was just coming over there and just knocking people's heads off, just generating an incredible amount of buzz, an incredible amount of tension. He was out there. He was on the scene now. People were talking about him as potentially being the best. The other one we saw was Anthony Joshua, a man who had a very established, a very respected amateur pedigree, who was also in the pros, undefeated, making a name for himself, beating everybody up. And we figured that there was eventually going to be a clash between these two. Now, that never ended up happening. But those were the two names that really came to the top and everybody was really talking about in the absence of Tyson Fury. Well, look at what we've seen since then. If we would have never seen what we saw, if we'd have never seen Tyson Fury come back, we'd have never seen Deontay Wilder receive those beatings, we'd have never seen what we saw from Anthony Joshua. The argument could be made that Tyson Fury was not the best of his generation. And maybe it was up in the air, maybe we gave it to Wilder, maybe who knows what would have happened at that point, right? But we don't need to go back and think about what if with history. We saw what we saw, and that's what we're talking about. And what we saw is that both of those men rose to the top in Tyson Fury's absence, and when he came back on the scene, he took one of them out. He took out Deontay Wilder, and he said, this man is not the best of his generation. He's only been over here generating all this buzz. He's only been getting all this hype. He's only been able to be as successful as he's been because I haven't been around. And in the course of 3 fights, completely dominates him. The man retires. Across the pond, we see Anthony Joshua. He gets smoked by Andy Ruiz. Andy Ruiz, the super underdog, man. Joshua was like, I don't know, like a 20-1 favorite, 25-1 favorite, or whatever it was. Andy Ruiz comes out there, late replacement, and with fast hands and a good punch, gets Anthony Joshua out of there. Now look, Joshua comes back, wins the rematch. Okay, maybe we just say that was a slip-up. Nobody's suggesting that Andy Ruiz is a better fighter, the best of his generation, anything like that. Then he comes out there and loses to Usyk too. So now you got a man with the 2 losses. It's like, that's it, man. That's it. Done for. Not only do we see flaws in the game, but with those 2 losses on your record, there's no way that we can speak honestly or respectably about you being the best of your generation when we have a man like Tyson Fury standing right there. I mean, to me, it's simple. He is the best of his generation, right? So when we look back during these time periods and we think about everybody who becomes elevated, Muhammad Ali, Larry Holmes, Mike Tyson, Lennox Lewis, Wladimir Klitschko, the next man in that line is Tyson Fury. And it was great watching him do his thing, man. The only thing that I can say is I think he's still in his prime. I wish he wasn't leaving so soon. I wish he was going to go out there and he was continuing to dominate because I think that he can. But I get it. He's already done probably everything that he wants to do. What's left for him? What's going to give him that motivation? What's going to get him up in the morning and just get him geeked about wanting to get in there and get after it? I don't know. I don't think Usyk's going to do it for him. I don't think he considers Usyk a big enough challenge. I don't think he considers Usyk big enough from a historical perspective as far as his resume is concerned. But he doesn't have to. I want to see him dominate for longer. I think instead of his reign being from 2015 to 2022, we could be talking about him for the next few years, 2025, 26. You know, heavyweights traditionally have a longer career than guys at the lighter weights. So who's to say how long that he could be there doing what he does? He still looks great. So let me know what you guys think. This is totally a subjective thing when we talk about the best heavyweights of eras and generations and where guys would place and things like that. But let me know what you think. Do you have a dispute with anybody that I mentioned from those different eras? Is there somebody else that should be in their place that was the most dominant of their generation? Or do you have a problem with Tyson Fury himself? There's somebody else that you'd like to see there? Do you think this is kind of an open period? Right? We didn't mention that. Are there times when there's an open period, when nobody really sets themselves apart from all the competition and rises up? Is that what we're looking at? Let me know what you guys think.